number of years ago, I wrote a column in the Grosse Pointe News about how kids are being shamed in PE class. So a mother of one of the kids that I was training at that time, I think he was like 13 or 14, she told me that she was upset. The reason why he was coming to see me is because he didn't feel confident enough in his phys ed class. And the reason why that was is because they were doing those presidential testing. Remember those?
Oh, the presidential fitness test.
You had to run like a mile at a certain time. You had to do
pull-ups,
push-ups, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And they were saying, okay, you need to do 30 sit-ups in a minute. No, I want to say it was 60 sit-ups in a minute. I can't
Yeah,
do
it was
that.
a lot, yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I was really irked. I wish I could pull up the article somewhere. I'm sure it's somewhere in the web. But I was upset to the fact that not only are these kids being held to a certain standard, but what that's doing is creating them an aversion to exercise later in life.
Yeah.
And so not too long ago, I was turned on to Brene Brown, and I'm sure you being in the field that you are, you know who she is. I listened to all of her TED Talks. She speaks a lot to vulnerability, and maybe that's something we can get into, but what shame is and what guilt is. And I would like to hear kind of like what your perspective on those two things are. And I'm sure I can relate that to kind of Syphus and exercise in general.
Yeah, so first of all, she's kind of like, she's a rock star in that field. Like, she pioneers the study of shame versus guilt. And anybody in social services, that's kind of like required viewing for us. So we're all, very well versed in her. But so her big thing is just kind of comparing and contrasting the function of shame and guilt. So just as a quick kind of Cliff Notes definition, so shame is that really, really intense, internalized feeling that we're not good enough.
Okay.
And it's fueled by like our irrational beliefs about ourselves, and it's hard to overcome, and it brings us down, and it's like, it's bad stuff. Like when you carry that, it doesn't feel very good. Guilt's actually pretty functional. So guilt is kind of like something that we do. It's behavior based, and we're measuring that against, like, objectively against like some standard in society or like our own value set, instead of like irrational beliefs. So like for example, let's say that you're driving around and you cut someone off accidentally, right? You didn't mean to do it, and it's like some old lady or somebody, and you look over and you're like, oh my God, how could I have done that? You may feel guilty about that. And so the guilt there is, I just cut her off, can't believe I did that, right?
Yeah.
But you kind of get over it and you move on, and maybe you adjust and you drive more carefully. Shame is, what kind of a person am I that I would cut off an old lady, and I suck, and it's...
So you've got some kind of, I don't know if it's empathy with
Yeah.
guilt, like you've got some kind of caring bone in your body that you're like, hey,
Yep,
you got
exactly.
some conscience. So I got to imagine that it's not all nature. Like, some of this has to be ingrained as a youngster growing up. Maybe you're often told that you are not good enough, or you can't excel at something, at something in particular.
Yeah.
That's probably not a good example, but I mean, your personality is crafted often at such a young age that I would imagine that if you have those negative thoughts of shamefulness, that those are probably learned at a young age.
It's really interesting that you say that, because shame actually develops earlier in life than guilt. So folks can start experiencing shame as early as 15 months.
Really?
And and that just tells you how irrational the belief is, right? Because when you're 15 months through like toddler, you don't operate out of like reason, right? They're not rational beings. They operate on emotion, right?
Yeah.
So everything's an emotional reaction.
Instinctual too.
Yeah. So guilt is, you develop that like 3 to 6 years. And you mentioned something about empathy. So empathy is a huge part of that, right? So if we don't have an understanding of how we relate to others, or that awareness of that, which we can't do as a 15-month-old, we can't experience guilt, because we can't compare that to how others operate. So shame is actually, we're programmed with that much earlier than guilt.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how is that? Like how can you? I would hope that a parent is not shaming their 15-month-old.
Yeah.
But how is that inserted into a 15-month-old or younger.
So parents do shame 15 months old. That's unfortunate. It doesn't always have to be as direct as that. So those are the times in your life when you're really developing attachments, right?
Okay.
So from 15 months to about 3 years, those are key attachment and bonding times for kids. So if, for example, you have a fussy kid, or they're crying out for, maybe they need food or attention or whatever it is, and those needs aren't being met, or they're being inconsistently met, or that kid can't predict when they can count on that person that's caring for them, that fuels shame, because what they're doing isn't achieving the goal that the behavior is designed to do. And the failure to meet that need, they bring that back to themselves as an emotional response. So that kind of is the bedrock of shame.
So other than just getting shamed, like maybe like verbally, or it could also be the absence of, or the presence of, a nurturing figure.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't have to be direct bad. It could also be no good.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Non-existent.
Right.
Interesting. And so I want to kind of get into the person who shames, and guilt tripping is a little bit different. I guess it's not really kind of hitting the context that you say. Like, I always hated, like my parents they would say, it'd be my birthday or something like that, or Christmas, and you get a present from like an aunt or uncle, and they're like, all right, well, what do you say? I'm like, I know to say thank you, Mom and Dad. You guys raised me well enough, but they didn't give me the opportunity to say thank you.
Right.
So it's almost like preemptively giving you a guilt trip. And then if you really don't follow through on whatever it is, that standard that they think that they want you to uphold, you're screwed.
Yeah. It's kind of an inverse guilt trip, because, you've got a higher standard for yourself than what they're projecting on you. So it's kind of like the opposite, because usually when you're guilty, it's that you've failed to meet a standard that others have for you.
Give me a chance to prove you wrong.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Guilt can be functional, right? So you may do something that leaves you feeling guilty, but there can be helpful guilt where that may be measured against a realistic standard, and then you use that to fuel some action to overcome whatever barrier it is, or whatever, because if it's one of those things where the kid's supported in a positive way on the front end, and says, man, you're one pull up away, or whatever it is, and you can do this and whatever, and there's, after some conditioning, it can be done.
Right.
There may be some guilt associated with that, but you can overcome it and increase performance. But the shame is what weighs you down against that irrational belief that's like, I'm not good enough for this, and this isn't for me.
Yeah.
So that's really what'll cut you off from it.
But can that be, for most people, corrected? Like,
shame?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say so. I don't think anything's impossible.
I'm thinking in context of exercise.
Sure.
If someone comes in here, no, you know what? I've had people say, like, I can't do this. I don't know if I'm up for that. I had somebody today that was like, frankly, I'm afraid. Yeah. Well, is there a way that I can change her mentality, or his mentality, away from shame?
Well, so here's the thing. You're talking about something that to me sounds more like vulnerability, right? So you have to look at where that fear is, right? So if the fear is coming from a place of like, I don't know if I can do this because these reasons, you're looking at more of like your focus is more on vulnerability, right? Because there's an awareness of fear with vulnerability, but you're willing to put yourself out there.
Right.
And that can take some work, right?
Yeah.
The shame piece, to me, that's more like a reactive thing, where it's like, I came to the turf for 3-4 sessions, and I literally fell flat on my face, and everyone laughed at me, and I can't go back. Like, I'm just ashamed. I was mocked. I was told this isn't for me, right? So to me, you're working with a couple of different things there.
I really think that you got like your guilt, shame, and then vulnerability kind of, it almost unlocks you from the feeling of shame and guilt. I don't know if that's true.
It buffers you, for sure.
Buffers you.
Yeah.
So, in my life, alcohol and that kind of stuff, I've had instances in my life where I felt extreme guilt. And I didn't know if it was shame. I still kind of like confused whether or not it was guilt or shame.
Yeah.
But I'm a bad father. That would be shame.
Yeah,
correct?
That would be shame.
But I feel guilty for the way that I acted. I imbibed.
Yeah.
And again, it was comparing myself to a different standard. But you know what? Had I not had that guilt or the empathy or the whatever it is, maybe I wouldn't have gotten sober because I knew that I didn't want to be that person.
Exactly. And what you're describing, I mean, you framed it very nicely, because the guilt, you referenced the behavior, right? Like, I feel guilty that I did this, right? Because it got in the way of my responsibilities or being a good father. And then the shame piece is the I'm a bad father, right? That's the irrational mind.
And once you have that thought, like I am, for me, it was very tough to get out of.
Yeah.
Like, oh my gosh, I am. So then it just self-perpetuates itself, at least from an addiction standpoint.
It does, yeah, because I mean, it's, you know, I would imagine that you feel like kind of powerless to pull yourself out of it, especially if there's not anybody, like if you're not surrounded by forces that kind of challenge that thinking with you, you know, because you're kind of in your own head in that situation, right?
Oh, yeah.
So it is it's self-fulfilling prophecy.
So you also said you're kind of powerless. I mean, that's part of 12 steps.
Yeah.
To me, admitting that you're powerless over whether it's a substance or a situation or the outcome of whatever's coming next, whatever lays before you, to me, that is that vulnerability again.
Yeah.
You are putting yourself out there, and you said a second ago about taking more chances. Vulnerability is just nothing but a chance to grow.
Sure.
But
exactly.
Many people shy away from that. And I think with Syphus, it puts you in a vulnerable state every single day.
Oh, totally, yeah.
And that's what I love. One of the many things I love about it. It could be the single exercise you're doing. You got to stop because you can't continue. It could be the day's, order of tasks. You just feel like not incompetent, but like maybe you're like, I can't figure this like progression out.
Yeah.
I like the fact that even though I've been doing this longer than anybody, I'm grounded every single day by the workout.
Yeah. Yeah. And, that's just, and there's so much of how it's designed that breeds that vulnerability, because, there is the variety in, however many hundreds of tasks that you have developed now in how many hundreds of different circuits. So like the fact that there's all that variety day to day, it forces you it forces discomfort, right? And the message across the board with fitness, with any life change is, anyone will vouch for the fact that that discomfort breeds change. You have to take yourself out of your comfort zone. Like the opposite of that is complacency, and you're not going to get anywhere with that, right? So, and that's what vulnerability is. It's kind of, it's a breeding ground for change and creativity and innovation.
And so you put yourself out there, whether it's on the turf or it's whatever you're doing. You put yourself out there, you change. There's got to be some kind of reward that like mentally that, like, I know that's how I feel. It's like, shoot, I put myself out there. That was hard to do, but you know what? I got some kind of like high from it because I overcame that obstacle. Can you speak to anything like related to that?
Yeah, well, that's just kind of it, because anytime you have thought processes or beliefs about yourself or beliefs about things that are largely irrational because they're not proven or because they're restricted to like limited circumstances. Like if I came here on day one on my free workout and fell on my face and that was what I used to define my experience for all of Syphus, that's not necessarily rational, right? Because I'm limiting my scope of understanding with that. So anytime you challenge that with an experience that counters it, that's like an opposite experience, you reprogram how you think about things.
Yes.
So there's a lot of reward there, and that's the root of a lot of psychotherapy. For example, like cognitive behavioral therapy, the number one most evidence-based practice that we use in social work, that's essentially what it boils down to. It's you have all these irrational thoughts, we're going to challenge those irrational thoughts and make that your new normal. So there's a lot of reward in that, because you over time you really start to change your mindset, and that means there's a decrease in fear, there's a decrease in guilt, there's a decrease in shame.
Right.
Because you're building confidence. So
building confidence is huge, and we spoke to that last night or 2 nights ago with a guest that we had on the podcast, and she's lost a tremendous amount of weight, and she kept using the word fat, and I don't like that word. You may be a larger person, but I am fat is again shame, but it's also physical form. I'm sure that's got to be like a different thing to deal with. I mean, but the fact that she keeps coming day after day after day, more than anybody else, I feel like there's got to be some kind of, something going on mentally in the Syphus trainer or the person who exercises avidly when they overcome, maybe it's a physical hurdle, or she sees, all right, there's 5 pounds I lost.
Yeah.
That reward.
Well, and just when you look at, like, I don't claim to know her very well. I don't know anybody here that well, to be honest, because I've not been around that long. But when I see her, either when I'm running with her or if I'm, the class before or after, and she's there, she's like animated. She's in a great mood. Like, she's interacting with everybody around her. Like, she's in her element, right? And that's just it. Like, she's created this support.
That she spoke to.
Which is huge. So I mean, you would have to think that, and that probably took a lot of work on her end, like what you're saying. I mean, you probably don't walk into this with that level of confidence.
It's about tearing down comfort zones.
Yeah.
A second ago, you said, "Well, I don't know all that many people on the turf, or they don't know me, or whatever." I think it's kind of funny because you've been here for not that long,
right?
And just because we've done a few of these videos, you probably know me already better than most people know me here. So it's. And that kind of goes into play with one thing I wanted to ask you about was, how does maybe guilt or shame or vulnerability play into social anxiety?
Well, I mean, in its extremes, it can prevent you from, like we talked about the shame piece specifically, like it cripples your ability to engage.
Right.
And it stifles creativity and it stifles innovation. And so you may not engage in social situations that may be of benefit to you because of either shame or that unhelpful kind of guilt. In its most extreme, it can develop into a social phobia. So, or
like agoraphobia.
Yeah, like agoraphobia.
Can you explain? That's fear of
fear of crowds.
Yeah.
And then so social phobias can also be specific situations where you may be like a socially adaptable person, but like. Yeah. Once you get out in front of like 50 people and have to give a speech or something, then you completely shut down to the point where it's like crippling, right?
So let's talk about that, or at least dissect that. Dissect me. I can public speak, no problem. I could, granted, it depends on what the topic's about and who's in the audience, but I have no problem speaking up in front of people. Where I struggle with is either idle conversation or just, small talk. Let's talk about the weather. I have a tough time doing that.
Okay.
And I don't know why I feel that way. I would almost much more prefer awkward silence. I have no problem sitting there, but other people have a problem sitting, quietly in a room with one other person. They'll have to like sit there and whistle or make a noise because they don't like awkward silence. Now I know that's not social anxiety.
Yeah.
But I do get anxious with a one-on-one conversation about how you feeling, how's your day?
Just like superficial type stuff?
Well, either that or if someone's getting to know me too well. I like to have a little bit of guarded safety. And I don't know if that's been exacerbated by becoming a business owner. That does change things a little bit when you're so exposed to the clientele.
What I would have to say to that is it's only a problem when it's a problem. We're all flawed. Right, and the fact that you have awareness of things that cause anxiety for you, or that cause discomfort, or whatever, especially when it concerns like interacting with others, that's okay. and to the point where like you feel like you can advocate for that, where it's like if you do share a space with someone, if you can't speak up for the fact that like, hey, just so we're cool, I'm totally okay with just sitting here. And sometimes it's hard for us to advocate for ourselves in that way because maybe that other person may not feel that way.
Right.
But it doesn't mean like it's dysfunctional. You know, like
Right.
it's okay to have that awareness and to put it out there, and it doesn't mean like you don't like function appropriately, and that comes from a set of experiences that you've been exposed to that other people may not have been.
I have an irrational fear that I would say is I am often so concerned with what the person across from me that I'm speaking to is thinking about me. When I'm having a conversation with you or whomever, I'm like always concerned whether or not, are you analyzing me? Can you tell that I'm nervous right now? Do they realize that this one-on-one conversation that I'm having is making, you know, my heart rate raise?
Yeah.
Like one of those things. And it's through, I think with guilt and shame, it's you're building more and more layers to protect you. And that vulnerability, that ability to open up and be transparent allows you to be, you know, liberated.
Yeah. And that's to me, and especially if I'm hearing you right, that's kind of what this is, like this whole thing, right?
Yes,
because
yeah.
you are aware of those parts of it that cause you anxiety, and you know, it's not necessarily irrational, right? Because you have reason to suspect that, you know, with me sitting across from you, I am analyzing you, right? Because that helps me engage, and it helps me kind of understand where you are, and also I'm a therapist, and you know, all this stuff, right? So so it's not all irrational, but the fact that you have awareness of these things going on, and this kind of almost takes us back to our mindfulness conversation.
Yes.
You can be aware of those things, push them to the side, and engage anyway, and put yourself out there. That is what vulnerability is. So.
I hate being misunderstood.
Yeah.
So, Syphus is one thing, you know, like I'm uber careful to try, like do my best to explain a task or whatever it is in its entirety. But I also am always so concerned that like, if I say something a certain way to like my mother-in-law or something like that, I'm like, no, like this is how I meant it, and I don't know how to. I'm like, did she really get how I wanted to come off?
So it almost sounds like, just to take us back to the beginning of the conversation, where you just hate it when people would interject with the "what do you say" when you're given a gift, and you didn't give them the chance to just let you say thank you, right? And it sounds like you're preloading that expectation on somebody else when it's like they probably misunderstood me, and I'm worried about whether or not I have to clarify for them.
Wow.
So you're almost doing the same thing.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah. And then, like, so those moments when you acknowledge that and you just let it go, I mean, how often are you, like, affirmed versus not?
It depends on who the person is, and it depends on the context. In Syphus, 10 times out of 10, I'm right.
Right.
Yeah, like,
naturally, right.
Yeah, so, like today, by the end of the workouts, I could tell every single person what questions they were going to have. So I would just tell them the answers to their questions prior to having it. I'll have it on the turf all the time when I'm teaching. Someone will look one way. I know that they're looking for reps. I know when someone's coming up to an exercise, I will already be demonstrating it if I'm paying attention to the classes I should.
Yeah.
And they'll be like, how did you know that's what I was going to say? It's like, I've been doing this a while.
Oh, yeah. I've had those thoughts, too. I'm like, get out of my head. So, yeah.
And I have eyes in the back of my head. Like, a lot of times I can just sense when people are coming to line number 1 and they're going to start on a new exercise. I could be doing something in the lobby, but I know where you guys are.
Right.
And I can, when it comes to form, I know who's got great form and then who's kind of doing something even out of the corner of my eye. If you didn't do 20 toe jumps on toes, I can tell that immediately.
Right.
It's just...
You sniff it out.
Yeah.
That probably comes from layers and layers and layers of experience and working with folks and having done this forever and knowing it inside and out. And
I had somebody walk in the lobby today. I didn't see her. All I heard was her and her keys. And I was like, is that Emily? Or is that whoever it is?
Yeah.
And she's like, yeah, how did you know that? I'm like, I have no clue. I could hear how your keys were jingling. I could just tell that was your walk.
Yeah.
That was weird.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And that's probably just knowing how her body moves. I just knew it was her.
Yeah, I mean, you're very aware of your environment. Yeah.
I don't know about that.
Well, you should, because I mean, that's what you're describing.
Well, you know what? I think sometimes I'm hyper aware.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I feel like in one of our earlier conversations, we mentioned like how that in a way was functional for you. Like your mind was such that you almost had to have all of those plates spinning to feel like wholly engaged.
Yeah, that's true. One thing, just kind of in the context of guilt as a motivator, can you speak to anything kind of just blanketed? Is there any positivity to guilt?
Yeah, huge.
I mean, well, you kind of said that, but
yeah. So again, it's important to understand guilt in terms of helpful guilt and unhelpful guilt.
Okay.
And the biggest difference between that is what you're measuring the behavior against, because the behavior is the consistent part of both, right? Because just to recap, shame is the irrational emotion piece, like the I am. So with helpful guilt, you're objectively measuring that behavior against like a society norm or like a family norm or a value that you have, whereas the unhelpful guilt is measured against the behavior is measured against some irrational belief.
Okay.
So again, like if you know that, you know, you're a stickler for like punctuality, right? Like let's say you have to be everywhere. Like if you're not 5 minutes early, you're late, right? So, and you show up and you meet with somebody that's really important, or you have like an engagement or whatever it is, and you show up 5 minutes late, right? And
I felt like I had that today. Even though we were going to meet at 8:30, I felt like we were supposed to meet at 8 o'clock.
Right.
And I get flustered. But anyways, almost like a concern about how does that person view me? Oh, that person's going to think I don't have my stuff together because I'm showing up late. I'm not organized. That like
Yeah, so you can use that to say that when you come out of that, you may come to whoever it is that you're supposed to be, like me, for example. You may come to me and say, "Hey man, I'm so sorry. You know, I know I said I was going to be there on time. I'm never late. I'm usually early, and blah blah blah." And I might say something like, "And you're cool. Don't worry about it. I'm fine." And you can recover from that because you know that it didn't compromise who you are or what you do.
But this is where I get caught up.
Yeah.
Does he really think it's fine that I'm late?
Yeah.
Is he just saying that?
So, depending on how you track that or where that goes with you, that can turn into that unhelpful guilt, right? Because or even shame.
Yes.
Because you might take that, like let's say you're virtually or literally never late for anything until this one time comes up. And you may say, "Oh my God, I've blown it. I'm not who I thought I was. I'm a loser." Okay, you know. So then you're treading into shame territory.
Okay.
And that's dangerous, right? Because that's that belief set where you've internalized that behavior and said, I can't, you know, whatever it is. So yeah, you're right. I mean, if you self-talk that enough, you're kind of walking a fine line.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely do that all the time. Like like you got a long drive after this. So for me, I'm like, I don't want to keep him, but at the same time, I don't think he'd be here doing it willingly if he didn't really have to, you know.
Yeah, and that's how you keep that in the helpful guilt. I mean, I'm not saying that, and I just kind of talked myself into this idea. If you didn't have that thought, where you had that like, oh, I'm a little worried that he's here late, but you know, I know that he wouldn't be here if he didn't want to. If you didn't even consider that and said, and just like flippantly was like, whatever, he's going to be here because this is what I want to do, and like, that's bad. Like it's more helpful to have that guilt than to not even be aware of it, right? Because again, it all comes back to that empathy piece. The fact that you are telling yourself like he's got a long drive and it's really late and all that stuff, that tells me that, you know, you're aware of my situation, which that shows empathy. And without that, I'd be like, well, who's this? You know, like what's going on here? So
you said helpful shame. No, you said helpful guilt.
Helpful guilt, right.
Helpful guilt. In the world of exercise, that helpful guilt is very helpful. Yeah. Because for me, I'm like, man, I had an indulgent weekend. I got to get back to the turf, or I gotta work out. It's not really like, at least for me and probably a lot of people that are here, it's not like really serious. Like I don't think like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna get out of shape. Yeah. But it is that nudge, like, hey, I got to do something good for myself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, think about it as like bumper bowling, right? Like you've got your lane and you got your pins. You're gonna knock the pins. You may run up on the.
Don't get too far out of.
Yeah, I mean, you may run into the gutters, but it's just going to kick you right back, right? So, you know, don't aim for the gutter, but also, like, it's going to happen, and you'll be fine, right? So, as long as you kind of stay the course. Yeah. So, yeah.
It's just, for Syphus, like I don't want people coming to work out that feel like against their will. Nobody does that here. I mean, you wouldn't do Syphus if it was against your will, trust me. But sometimes in the fitness industry, people don't want to work out. They don't want that, but they need someone to keep them accountable. That's what personal trainers are many times for.
Yeah.
Granted, if you don't find the actual passion or whatever it is that makes you tick, you're not going to stick with it. You know, if you keep giving yourself that guilt talk or shameful thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and what I appreciate about Syphus in particular is that I feel like there are lots of layers of buffers to that guilt, because, you know, with traditional methods of fitness, it seems like it's kind of one or the other. So you either have the group accountability mentality, or you have the individualized attention of a coach or a trainer, or you have an engaging workout that you enjoy that holds you accountable, or you have variety. And here, like, and we talked about this before, it's like there are many different, Syphus can be many different things to you on any given day. And a lot of times, like, it may be one or more of those things that challenge that guilt for you, and that help you move past that into your vulnerability and get you back here day to day.
Right.
So, yeah, so to me, there's a lot of layers here that buffer that.
So with, in regards to how we spoke to vulnerability as it pertained to Syphus, I feel like every day you come here, you're learning something new. You're kind of putting yourself out there physically, mentally. There's a great deal of humility also that comes in with Syphus. And I want to know, give me the difference between vulnerability and humility, if you could do that.
So, in a nutshell, humility is the behavior of someone who demonstrates vulnerability. So they're very interconnected. So somebody who's vulnerable is aware of their flaws or their shortcomings or their opportunities, or however you want to frame it, right? They're aware of those things, and that informs their actions. So like vulnerability is not, so you can't really be vulnerable if like you have that awareness and then you're like, you overcompensate for that by being like cocky or whatever it is. So like you being humble and being aware of those flaws or those challenges or those opportunities and behaving in a way that like says to folks, especially if you're in a leadership role, it's like, hey, you know what? I'm not perfect. And I know that, and that's why I'm here. Is because I have a chance to get better. They're very connected.
What you're saying is what I've been trying to say with Form First.
Yeah.
I feel that as we spoke to in like our short episodes, that people hit this like increase in score. Many people don't want to take the fall.
Yeah.
They don't want the boulder to fall back down.
Yeah.
Both metaphorically, and we call the stat the boulder, because they've got too much pride to see that score drop. They don't want to be vulnerable. They don't want to be humiliated. For me, when I took a 200-point hit within the last 2 years, that was a very, not humiliating feeling, but it made me feel humble.
Yeah, totally.
And for me, I feel better with that sense of vulnerability. But you said if people do not feel vulnerable, then you said something about like
you can't act on vulnerability without humility.
You can't act on vulnerability without humility.
Right, because I mean it takes an awareness of your weaknesses and opportunities and your challenges to act in a way that acknowledges those things, but also puts you in a position where you can improve or can engage. Because otherwise, you know, the vulnerability piece is being transparent about all that. And if you're not humble, not only are you not transparent, but you're overcompensating for those flaws. So that's kind of, it achieves the opposite effect. I mean, you can't be vulnerable without humility.
And correct me if I'm wrong, that's probably true in the sense that you cannot be humiliated to feel vulnerable. Does that make sense?
You can't be humiliated?
So there's a difference between the word humility and someone humiliating you.
Sure.
You cannot be coerced into feeling vulnerable or humble. Is that?
Yeah, no, I mean, not like Right. It can't be like imposed by somebody else.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's more like, it's more internal than that. Like being vulnerable and therefore acting with humility is not an it's not an externally defined thing. That has to come from within.
I'm trying to frame this in the way, like an example. Like just being the word like humiliated, I'm sure that that's kind of confusing some things, but if somebody, dragged you out on stage and you were either forced to give a speech or told a very embarrassing story about you, that's a forced feeling of vulnerability. I didn't choose to be here right now. I didn't choose to be exposed. I'm sure that that's not going to make a person feel growth. They're going to feel shamed.
Well, and I think the more accurate term for that you kind of slipped in there is exposed. Like that's exposure. Like that's, because vulnerability by definition is something that comes from within. So the fact that was kind of like forced by
that's what I was saying.
Yeah.
So it comes from within.
You're exposed, or that's a whole different ballgame. So you kind of have to have that awareness and act on it independently for it to be vulnerability.
And so I feel like people build up those walls, those barriers, those masks of, a facade, because they don't want that exposure. They don't want somebody else to expose me. Only I'm going to do it. And is that pride? Is that...
It depends on where it's coming from, because those walls can also be protecting something else. So it's easy to and obviously the more you know a person, the more you can really speak on this. It's easy to kind of assume where that compensatory or over-compensatory behavior is coming from and say, oh, they're just being... And, we talked about this in one of the first conversations about somebody who's chasing that score, for example, and sacrifices for him or whatever else. We may assume that's a pride thing and they don't want that boulder to fall or whatever it is. Or they may be that may be the one time for them to perform or feel good about themselves or whatever it is. So yes, there's a chance that it's pride or it's something that's overcompensating for some feeling of shame or unhelpful guilt because they don't want to lose that progress or they don't feel like they can do any better, or it can be something else. So there's a risk of it for sure.
What's the adage? Don't assume. To assume is to make an ass of you.
Yeah, exactly.
I try to remind myself of that all the time. When am I assuming something about somebody? And it happens a lot, especially with new people.
Well, and to take it back to your example about exposure versus vulnerability, with that kind of as the context, nobody can assume vulnerability in anyone. Except themselves, right? Because that is so internally defined. So we can't just look at somebody and say, oh, well, this is obviously compensating for a lack of vulnerability or for... So because only they know that until they engage you in a way that exposes their weakness, and then that, by definition, is vulnerability.
You just said exposes their weakness, and that's exactly what I was thinking when you said it. So one of the things about Syphus that I love is that it doesn't matter how strong you are, how fit you are, it will expose whatever weakness it is that you have. And by the very fact that people are here willingly and they want to do it, they're saying, I want to feel vulnerable. I want this. No one's dragging me here, so you can't instill vulnerability or expose me because I'm here by my own will. I want to be here.
Well, and I love how this ties into other conversations that we've had, whether or not they've been aired. This takes us back to going through the Sypher that we talked about, what accomplishment means in terms of how we feel about ourselves, right? So that unhelpful guilt, that helpful guilt that allows us to expose ourselves and be aware of our weaknesses and actively work towards improving those things, which then lead to accomplishment. That, in theory, is far more satisfying than being complacent with something that we know we're shortchanging ourselves on, whether that's score chasing or sacrificing for them, whatever it is. So
the pro is not a referee.
Yeah.
We're not going to tell you whether or not you're doing it right or wrong. I mean, we will if you're going to hurt yourself or if it's just not the right exercise.
Or if you ask and...
But you got to hold yourself to a certain standard.
Right.
And again, if it's guilt, or I will have guilt because my knee didn't touch the turf on a lunge. I'll redo it. but you can't instill that guilt in somebody, and that's exactly it.
Yep.
We're not trying to make anyone feel guilty. They're here exercising, doing the best that they absolutely can do. And to hold them to a form first is to instill guilt, but how do you do that but in a way that's just positive? It's such a hard thing to do.
Yeah, well, and that's where, like, you know, you talk about that reward and how when you challenge those irrational thoughts or whatever's going on with things that replace it that are far more satisfying or positive, that applies to the turf, because it's like you may feel that guilt or you know, whatever the reaction is from not doing that exercise correctly, especially if you're aware and you come out of that workout like, man, I could have done better, or I didn't do this right. But when you get it right the next time, or when that score increases, or when you don't have to ask the pro about the form, that's your reward, and that feels really good. Like your brain just floods you with, you know, endorphins and serotonin and everything else. So like,
we discussed it last time too.
Yeah.
It's like, I was like, I don't know if it's not, people are not aware of their body movements, or is it falling upon me or the pro to like just keep going over and try to say like, no, this is the correct form, not that. We're not trying to make you feel guilty. We're trying to teach you.
Yeah.
And like you said, it feels really good to actually know that you are acting with integrity. You can hold your head up high. You have a clear conscience. And I feel like this exercise method is being able to teach you that.
So to not actively to steer this conversation in a different direction, but it definitely applies. When the work that I do, I hear so much about like defiance, right? We have defiant kids, and they just raise hell for the sake of raising hell, and they try to manipulate and get what they want. So it's doing the thing that goes against what seems to make sense for that kid, and that kind of comes back to the turf where it's like, in your mind, you're like, man, if they would just do it this way and follow my direction, they would get so much more out of it. And it's almost like they're putting more energy towards like not listening to me than doing it. So with that said, like you almost have to believe that something else is going on because it doesn't make sense for them to put more energy in ignoring you and not doing it than doing it and reaping the benefits of just following it.
Or like if I'm demonstrating an exercise for somebody who's been doing it a long time, they're like, oh, my body can't do that. I'll never be able to do that. I'm like, as long as you keep saying that, you will never be able to do it.
Exactly, you're right.
And it's like, let's just back up. Let's do it the way it was intended, and maybe we'll be able to get there. Flexibility or cardio, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I've gained a certain amount of sobriety that I felt comfortable kind of opening up and sharing these thoughts. Like it gave me the confidence to have the courage to say like, there is something deeper at play here with Syphus. I've always known that, but now that I've kind of gone through some of these trials and tribulations, I can kind of speak from experience and say like, hey, this is real. Yeah. But at the same time, I don't want to look like I'm like the second coming of anything like I'm just trying, it's exercise, and I've just connected some dots.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and that's what makes it more meaningful, right? Because it is relatable, and yet there's this like bigger force to it. So, but it's accessible. Like none of this that we're talking about is inaccessible, right? Because I mean these are conclusions and connections that anybody can come to if they're open to it.
Right.
So, and hopefully we're kind of facilitating that thought process with folks by just talking about it.
I feel like too often, like some people just don't want to like sit there and think think about that idea, whatever it is, for long enough to have the attention span to like see it out. Yeah. That's why I think exercise and seeing it in physical form is a great way to express it and to teach. If you're reading about morals and ethics and that kind of stuff in a book, you may not understand it. You may not apply it. But if you can see it played out in exercise, movement, the way you treat others, like physically, like in Syphus, I'm not going to, part of the Sypher way back was like, I am not going to cheat my brother in pursuit of a higher score. Okay. So I'm not going to cheat you, the person next to me, because I want to score higher. You can't, it's the same thing as the golden rule, you know, treat others as you want to be treated. Yeah. This Syphus has a great way of showing that. displaying that, if you look at it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Anyways, oftentimes, especially early in my recovery, I felt like forever indebted to the people that you've harmed and hurt.
Oh, yeah.
But there comes a certain time where you are becoming a doormat and a pushover, and you lose yourself in it.
Yeah.
And so, especially from a business standpoint, you can't be that way. You cannot be a pushover. You cannot bend over backwards for anybody or anything just because you have this guilty conscience.
Yeah.
And for me, I have lived with a guilty conscience for a number of years, and it undercuts some of the important underpinnings of the way, I guess, a business owner has to act, a husband has to act. You have to have confidence, and without having the exposure or the transparency, the vulnerability of either your actions or your remorse or whatever, you're not going to get that.
Huge point with like acting with humility, because humility doesn't assume that you're useless, right? Even when you're like coming to the turf, like if you're showing vulnerability by showing up, by being here, by being aware of your flaws or weaknesses, and you push through it anyway, there's a presumption that you can do it, right? Like, you know what, I may suck at this, but you know what, I show up this many days a week and I give it my all when I'm here, and I work really hard and I feel so much better when I go home or whatever. So like, it's not an all or nothing thing.
Yeah.
And I talked with you very early on about this AA process, where one of my hangups with that model as a social worker is it almost like, and you presented it to me in a way that got me thinking about how I frame it, but it almost presented it, I almost look at it as it almost excludes strength, right? Like you're surrendering yourself to...
It removes your will. That's essentially what it is.
You
turn your will over to a higher power.
Right. And to me, like I've always had hangups, because in my mind, there's not a person in this world who in their lowest moment doesn't have strength or something to hang on to.
I disagree.
Okay.
Because when a physical addiction is really, really that physical, you I couldn't overcome it.
It's a relative thing, right? Even at your lowest, there's at least a flicker of light. To bring that back to this, vulnerability and humility discussion, if you show up and you're aware of those opportunities and those flaws and weaknesses, again, you've got to have something to hang on to that gives you strength to push through.
Brene Brown says just show up.
Right, exactly. Show up with all of your baggage, like with your awareness that you're not the best at this, and you have room to grow, and but you're here and you can get through it, and you're not going to die, and that's for some people that's where you start.
Okay, so you spoke to it a while ago, is saying the reason why we're kind of doing this in broad terms is to allow myself to kind of, I don't want to say expose myself, that just sounds weird, but allow myself to be as transparent as I would like to be with members that maybe I can't reach it. It's not this turf, it's a different location. It's being able to help others allows me to help myself. If I wasn't as transparent as I've been as of late, especially, it solidifies my sobriety. It solidifies my form first mentality, and it just helps me to help other people.
Yeah.
And whether or not they take it or not, for me, it's just a positive thing to be able to actually share some of these stories.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And not everybody who has those experiences, the fact that you have that awareness or that vulnerability is in awareness of your challenges or weaknesses or your struggle. Not everyone uses that for good. Like some folks are destructive with that experience too, where that informs how they negatively engage with others, or they need to bring other people down to their level, or whatever it is. So the fact that you went through a process to take this information and frame it the way you are now is protective, not just for yourself, but for the way that you use the information. So especially
being on a social, like something like YouTube, that's out there everywhere.
Yeah, right. Like anybody can cue that up.
So it's, that talk about vulnerability, and maybe that's what I'm thriving off of with these podcasts and with what we're doing here, is that it's like maximum vulnerability. Granted, we edit some of this stuff, but it's like, all right, I'm going to put myself really out there now. Whereas before, I used to shroud Syphus. I didn't want people posting pictures. I didn't want the boards being captured. I wanted to cover it up like myself. Well, now it's like, I want to share this with people. Yeah. You know, and in order to get that, you need Syphus. You need to understand kind of me myself too. So let's show everybody.
So I like the way, in my mind, I think of it as like hidden in plain sight, right? Like you said, you had this all shrouded and you were protecting it, and you were very cautious about how it was exposed or if it was at all. But like the connections that we're making through discussion that kind of organically come out of conversations that, you know, granted we have topics and we have ideas, but this conversation that's happening that you're putting out there for other people, it's hidden in plain sight. Like it's out there, but it doesn't necessarily naturally occur to people. So the fact that this is being put out there now allows people to get out of Syphus what you intended, right? Instead of just that one piece that one person might extract that one day from the program. So I mean, it's like a fog is kind of lifting up the whole thing.
And the way I told you on the first time we shot a video, you learn quicker than most. I guess what my goal is for some of this is to teach people that, all right, you've only been doing it maybe a month, 2 months, 6 months. Yeah. If you keep going with this, there's a lot more to get out of it. There's a lot more to learn. And I mean, I thank you for being able to help me share that, because it can be intimidating or like overwhelming if I were trying to like say all this stuff to somebody like in the beginning.
Right. Have you heard the good word about
Right. Yeah. No, that's creepy, right? So like when I'm teaching initiation or newbie too, and people give me like a weird look like, is this the right exercise, or are you sure this is the right thing to do? Like I'll say trust the process. I'm like, just believe me, this is right. You're on the right exercise, or you're in the right progression. Yeah. So you got to let people figure it out.
Yeah. Well, and again, like it's, you know, I'm a huge video game guy. Like that's how that. Oh God, yeah. That's how I like escape from I'm in such a heady space all day. Yeah. That sometimes I look for like escapist things to do. So I get into video games, and one of the coolest things to me about, especially the kinds of video games that I play, is the progression system, right? So like when you first fire up a game, you're learning the basics. Like
give me an example of like video games.
Okay, so
I don't know anything about video games.
Yeah, so I play a lot of like shooter RPG, like role playing type, like big scale adventure type games, right? Yeah. And you know going into it just how big of a game it is. But you start with just kind of, and a lot of folks cleverly integrate this into like the story mode or whatever it is, to where it's like move around this joystick to look around, right? And it's incorporated in a way that's creative, and you're like, oh cool, okay, this is how I look around, and this is how this is how you fire this gun, right? And you start there, and you build and you build and you build, and you learn it, you get that thrill out of accomplishing that first objective or what it is, and then hours and hours and hours later, or days later, or whatever it is, like you're tackling like the big stuff that you knew you would get to, that was kind of teased earlier in the game or whatever it is, whether that's story driven or like technical driven, right? Yeah. And to me, like this is almost like a gamification of
it's definitely
fitness.
That's so like how we presented a lot.
So like for me, and to be perfectly honest, in my vulnerability, I'm still in a spot where like I'm getting the basics down, right? Because I had a 3-month stint, I went away for a year. I'm back. I'm kind of in my third month again. Yeah. I'm still getting basics, right? I'm getting more comfortable. Yeah. But part of what drives me is this awareness of like, oh man, like once I like get this down and like my endurance increases, like I'm going to go after this. And
once you learn the joystick and how to look around,
then like, I can really go after the big stuff.
Like everything you were describing, like the components and the little things, and you're tackling the bigger, like, dude, I mean, that is Syphus.
Yeah, exactly. And that's cool to think about. So like, and I would imagine for you to kind of, go over with the new folks, like, this is how you look around, knowing that there's this so much bigger thing out there. But
it is, and then you're just hoping, like, just stick with it. Not from a financial commitment. That's not what I want. I want you to stick with it to learn this because it's so awesome.
It gets so much bigger. So.
And it's funny because like we have a lane for new people.
Yeah.
They'll see other people working out that have been doing this a long time, and they're just like, how are they crawling like that? Like, I'll never be able to do that. It's like
there was that one day, and I want to say it was like the last time, right before we did the last podcast. Like, it was all newbies and me.
Oh, yes.
And I remember, like...
It was a family.
It was a family, and it was like one of the few times I've broken, 500. And I did my run, and, a few of them, like, they tapped out, like, 30 minutes in or whatever. And at the end of my run, I go into the little, like, the lobby area, and they're like, dude, man, it was so good. Like, how did you do? And I felt like such a badass, Like,
let's talk about that.
Yeah.
You said it was one of the few times that you broke 500.
Yeah.
I thrive off of when I know I've got a crowd. When I know that people are watching me shoot. When we're doing this, I usually perform better when I know that somebody's paying attention.
Yeah.
It goes. Do you know what quantum mechanics is and quantum physics?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like the double slit experiment says that, like, essentially nothing is in existence until it's observed.
There's a quantum psychology too.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Go.
Like your awareness of yourself being fully informed by the reality of other people's experience.
That was. Let's go over that another time.
Yeah, we'll save that.
Sounds interesting. I need to.
Yeah.
Be more mentally clear.
Yeah, I have a book. I'll loan it to you.
So I studied quantum mechanics on a superficial level just because I was interested in it.
Yeah.
But the fact that something can't be in existence until it's actually observed or measured or seen, I feel like exercise and performance is kind of the same way. Like, when you know someone's watching you, you may try to boost your performance a little bit. So you knew these people had never seen it. Well, shoot, I'm going to show them a bear crawl. I'm going to show them the jigsaw.
Right.
And so maybe, whether it was conscientious or not, maybe that helped you perform.
Oh, it did, yeah. And I'm glad you said it that way, because in my mind, I'm like, okay, this is like probably one of the few times I'm going to get to, like, look like I really know what I'm doing stacked against the other people. Well, that's my narrative. Like, that's my unhelpful guilt, right? So there's that side, but then you're right. There's also the, like, okay, so their relative point for this is you as the pro, and then me as the person who's been here. I'm like, okay, if I'm gonna step it up, now's the time to do it, because, like, they're gonna look at me as, okay, I'm doing this for the first time, and this person's been here for at least a little bit, so, like, this is what I can expect. So
that's a good point too.
Yeah.
So you gave yourself a standard, almost to kind of like represent the brand, or like my methodology.
Yeah, because
like,
I think
in the proper light.
Yeah, because I think because we were doing a podcast, I was also decked out in Syphus gear too. So, like, I was rocking the brand, and I was like, I can't.
Full junkie.
This is not the time to fall on my face.
Gosh,
so,
man.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's kind of wrap it up.
Okay.
Such good stuff that I can't thank you enough just for giving me the platform and ability to kind of share some kind of disconnected thought.
It gets me excited too, because like I said before, one of the things that brought me to you about this to begin with was the fact that, like, this is something that I do professionally that just naturally fits into something that I do to kind of, like, escape from my professional self.
Yeah.
And when you can get excited about what you do in a way that just naturally fits into your life, like, it's just, you want to share that. So.
And we're just getting started with this.
Yeah.
Honestly, we'll pursue it for as long as it's helping other people.
Totally, yeah.
And I do think it will help other people. And saying that, we'll have an email address that people could actually email us, whether or not it's on social networks or Twitter. I mean, we're always accessible, but we'll have an email address that we'll put maybe, like, in the description of this video, where they can ask us, like, if they have any just general questions about Syphus or about mental health.
Yeah.
Because I think that we want to open up the discussion to other people as well.
Yeah, and the really cool thing about that is, and we've talked about this before, is that I'm getting asked about, like, things like that now, just kind of ad hoc, where, like, a member was talking to me earlier about, like, hey, remind me to talk to you about burnout.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and just randomly, and I'm like, sweet, yeah, let's do that. And then at the picnic, somebody was telling they had integrated something that we had talked about in one of the podcasts into, it's just like you all were saying today about crisis versus being proactive.
Yes.
And for me, that's like, that's worth it.
So
like
what we're doing here is being vulnerable and transparent to these people so that way we can be approached.
Right.
You know, today I was approached by somebody else that I never would have thought had a medical issue because he was stressed out, always working, you know, not sleeping enough. And he was just saying that, like, the reason why he comes here is because he gets 1 hour to not think about anything else but this.
Yeah.
I said that in the podcast that I released today.
Yeah.
I'm like, did you watch that? He's like, no, I don't even go on YouTube. I don't even know, like, how to use it.
Oh,
and so
man.
I'm like, this is so, it's crazy how that serendipity kind
Yeah.
of happened. But we're trying to get this out there so that way those kind of things happen more often. We can be approached.
Again, yeah, I think it can be carried on because it's life, so it doesn't stop. Yeah.